In 1991, Sony was publicly humiliated when Nintendo cut them out of their own console project on stage. Most companies would have walked away. Instead, Sony responded by trying to build something much bigger, an entertainment empire spanning music, movies, gaming, and even the phones in your pocket. So how did a company that started by repairing radios in a ruined city end up trying to control nearly every screen in the world? This is the story of Sony's bold rise, and the moment ambition almost became too big to manage. In 1945, Japan wasn't thinking about innovation. It was thinking about survival. Cities were damaged. Infrastructure was shattered. Electricity was unreliable. Families were rebuilding life one day at a time. In Tokyo, inside a partially destroyed department store, a man named Masaru Ibuka was repairing radios. Radios mattered. They connected people to news, information, and hope. Ibuka wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to fix things that mattered. Soon, he met Akio Morita, a young physicist from a respected family who believed Japan could one day export ideas, not just labor. Together, in 1946, they formed a small company with a very unmemorable name, Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo. The company had almost no capital. Their early experiments failed. They built a rice cooker that couldn't cook rice evenly. They designed electronics nobody wanted, but failure wasn't fatal because expectations were low. Instead of copying Western products, they obsessed over miniaturization, smaller radios, portable devices, technology that fit into daily life. That obsession paid off when they embraced transistor technology, something many Western firms dismissed as impractical. Sony didn't dismiss it. They perfected it. By the 1950s, Sony was exporting transistor radios to the United States, quietly changing how people consumed media. Then, in 1958, the company renamed itself Sony, a name chosen because it could be spoken anywhere. Sony wasn't just rebuilding Japan's economy. It was rebuilding Japan's identity. Sony's defining moment didn't come from laboratories. It came from listening. In the late 1970s, Sony executives noticed something strange. People loved music, but they had to stay near it. Stereos were stationary, radios were communal. So Sony asked a radical question. What if music became private? The result was the Walkman, a tiny device that let people carry sound with them. It wasn't just a product. It was a behavioral shift. Music became emotional, personal, portable, and Sony learned a lesson that would guide the next 40 years. The Walkman didn't scream power. It whispered intimacy. And Sony realized something else. If you control the device and you control the content, you control the experience. That idea would push Sony into its boldest and riskiest acquisitions. In 1988, Sony stunned the business world. They paid $2 billion to acquire CBS Records, the largest purchase of an American company ever made by a Japanese firm at the time. Critics called it reckless. Politicians called it dangerous. But Sony wasn't buying a label. They were buying leverage. CBS Records didn't just own artists, it owned the most valuable music catalog on earth. And Sony had just plugged that catalog directly into its hardware empire. The timing couldn't have been better. Sony inherited Michael Jackson at the absolute peak of his power. Albums, tours, licensing, money flowed in from every direction. At the same time, the world was quietly changing formats. Vinyl was fading, cassettes were aging, and Sony was ready. Because Sony didn't just own the music, the software. They owned the factories, the patents, and the players, the hardware. They pushed CDS aggressively. Retail followed. Consumers adapted. The world switched formats almost overnight. Sony got paid twice, once for the disc, once for the player. This double dip made Sony staggeringly wealthy throughout the 1990s. Under Sony's wing, artists like Mariah Carey, Celine Dion, and Pearl Jam became global icons. Sony Music became the most powerful force among the big three labels. From the outside, it looked like total victory, but this success created a blind spot. Sony believed the format war was over, and fear replaced curiosity. As digital files spread online, Sony Music panicked. Instead of asking how music should evolve, they focused on stopping copying. Sony Music and Sony Electronics stopped cooperating. They became silos. Sony Music was so afraid of piracy that they blocked the electronics division from building a simple, consumer-friendly MP3 player. The company that invented the Walkman froze itself. In 2005, fear turned into disaster. Sony shipped CDs containing hidden rootkit software, spyware meant to prevent copying. Consumers revolted. Governments investigated. Sony's reputation took a major hit. And while Sony defended yesterday's model, Apple walked in and took the future. The iPod was simple. iTunes was easy. Sony had the music. Sony had the hardware. But internal fear let a computer company steal the Walkman's throne. Eventually, Sony accepted a hard truth. Selling discs wasn't the future. Owning songs was. One of Sony's smartest and quietest moves came through publishing. Sony partnered with Michael Jackson to form Sony/ATV. This deal controlled songwriting rights, not recordings, including the Beatles catalog. While formats rose and fell, publishing royalties kept flowing. Years later, Sony fully acquired Sony/ATV. Today, Sony is the largest music publisher in the world. Sony Music now owns or controls massive back catalogs, streaming royalties, licensing deals, and artist services. What once looked risky became foundational. But Sony wasn't done, because music wasn't the biggest cultural force. Movies were. In 1989, Sony did something even bolder. They acquired Columbia Pictures. Hollywood reacted with disbelief. A Japanese electronics company owning a major American movie studio? Politicians worried. Media panicked. Critics mocked. But Sony understood something Hollywood didn't. Movies weren't just entertainment. They were global storytelling engines. Sony again made the same move. They provided capital, then stepped back. Instead of micromanaging creatives, Sony let Columbia operate independently, focusing on scale, efficiency, and global reach. Over time, Columbia, later Sony Pictures, found stability. And today, Sony Pictures remains one of the strongest studios in the world. Not always the flashiest, but consistently profitable. Fast forward to the streaming era. Hollywood entered a brutal arms race. Disney poured billions into Disney Plus. Warner Brothers burned cash building HBO Max. Paramount struggled to scale Paramount Plus. Every studio wanted to own the platform. Every studio wanted subscribers. And nearly all of them lost billions doing it. Sony made a different decision. They chose not to launch a major streaming service, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. Instead, Sony positioned itself as Hollywood's arms dealer. They focused on what they did best, producing high-quality films and television, owning valuable IP, and selling streaming rights to the highest bidder. Often, that bidder was Netflix. Sony didn't fight the platforms. They supplied them. While other studios paid billions to attract subscribers, Sony collected guaranteed licensing revenue with no platform risk. This Switzerland strategy, neutral, flexible, and disciplined, turned Sony Pictures into one of the most consistently profitable studios in Hollywood. They didn't need to win the streaming war. They made money from everyone fighting it. Sony now owned the devices, the music, the movies. They had built a cultural supply chain. And then, gaming entered the picture. Sony didn't enter gaming with a master plan. They entered by accident. At first, Sony was just a supplier building sound chips for Nintendo, but one engineer, Ken Kutaragi, saw what others didn't. Games were no longer toys. They were becoming entertainment. When Nintendo publicly cut Sony out in 1991, it ended a partnership, but it freed Sony to rethink gaming entirely. Sony rebuilt the console from the outside in. Instead of focusing on hardware first, Sony focused on developers. Cartridges were expensive. Approval was slow. Creative freedom was limited. Sony removed friction. They embraced CDS, cheap, spacious, and easy to use. They made development tools accessible. They let studios take risks. Developers rushed in. Sony also changed who gaming was for. They stopped marketing to children. PlayStation was aimed at teenagers and young adults. Stylish, edgy, and cultural. Gaming grew up. Then came Sony's smartest move. The PlayStation 2 wasn't just a console. It was the cheapest DVD player available. Millions bought it for movies, then stayed for games. The PlayStation 2 became the best-selling console in history. Sony didn't win by overpowering Nintendo. They won by understanding creators, culture, and timing. The betrayal that humiliated Sony didn't just create a console. It created a mindset, and that mindset turned an outsider into the center of gaming culture. But dominance has a cost, because once Sony controlled the living room, they wanted the pocket. In 2000, a fire broke out at a Philips microchip plant in New Mexico. It seemed minor, but that plant produced critical chips for mobile phones. One of its biggest customers was Ericsson, a Swedish telecom giant. Ericsson's supply chain collapsed. Orders were delayed. Production stalled. Meanwhile, Nokia surged ahead. Ericsson realized something painful. Telecom was no longer just infrastructure. It was consumer experience. And Ericsson didn't have that strength. Sony did. In 2001, Sony and Ericsson formed Sony Ericsson. The logic was perfect on paper. Ericsson brings networks. Sony brings design, branding, and entertainment. Early success followed. Stylish phones, music phones, camera phones. Sony Ericsson felt innovative, but the market changed again. Smartphones arrived. Touchscreens, app ecosystems, platforms, not products. And joint ventures moved slowly. Sony Ericsson struggled to adapt. While Apple and others built ecosystems, Sony Ericsson built features. Eventually, Sony made the decision. They bought out Ericsson's stake. Sony Ericsson became Sony Mobile. But phones were no longer about hardware excellence. They were about obsession. Sony Mobile survived, but never dominated. Sony didn't fail, but it didn't try to own everything forever either. Over time, Sony learned where control mattered and where restraint created more power. Today, Sony is quieter, more disciplined, less flashy, but still formidable. Sony Music thrives. Sony Pictures profits by staying neutral. PlayStation remains a global force. Sony didn't survive by winning every battle. It survived by choosing the right ones. And while Sony was busy building an entertainment empire that touched nearly every screen in your life, They quietly made one deal that would trap the most valuable superhero in history. A deal so airtight that even Disney still can't break it. And in the next video, you'll see how Sony ended up owning Spider-Man, and why Disney still doesn't fully control him today.